Hey there, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're exploring a seriously fascinating crossover between sociological research and the huge impact of teacher expectations. We're going to look at literally one of the most audacious field experiments ever pulled off in sociology. It's all about understanding how a student's identity and achievement get shaped right inside the very institutions that are supposed to be educating them.
I want you to imagine something for a second. Picture stepping into a classroom on your very first day. You sit down, you're eager to learn, you're ready to go. But what if your entire future in that room was subtly dictated by a hidden label that you didn't even know you had? What if your teacher's unspoken perception of you influenced not just how they treat you, but how you actually end up performing? Crazy, right? But this isn't just a hypothetical scenario, it's actually a core concept in the sociology of education.
Okay, let's dive into this. The big concept we're talking about here is the self-fulfilling prophecy. Basically, sociological theory says this happens when a pupil takes on the label they've been given by a school or a teacher, and then, whether they realize it or not, they start acting accordingly. It really highlights the sheer power of teacher agency, that autonomous power teachers have to profoundly influence and affect their pupils.
So here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We're going to start off with the power of labels. Then we'll break down how field experiments work, dive into the classic Pygmalion study, explore the self-fulfilling prophecy, run through a PET evaluation, and finally, weigh ethics against knowledge.
All right, Chapter 1. Let's talk about the power of labels.
To really get how sociologists look at the classroom, we first need to understand how teachers view their students. According to labeling theory, teachers often attach labels to pupils that actually have very little to do with the student's real ability or intelligence. Instead, they kind of form an opinion based on how closely a student fits this stereotype of the ideal pupil. That might be based on their background, how neat they are, or just their general behavior. And these initial assessments are absolutely crucial. Because if a student gets labeled as troublesome right off the bat, the teacher interacts with them differently. And that interaction literally shapes the student's reality.
Moving on to Chapter 2. Field Experiments Explained.
Now you might be wondering, if sociologists think these invisible labels dictate student success, how do they actually go about proving it in the real world? Well, in the natural sciences, you'd usually just use a lab experiment, right? Highly controlled variables, totally artificial setting. But sociologists, they often prefer field experiments. These happen in real-life settings, like an actual functioning school, dealing with messy, unobservable, and super complex human variables. Interpretivists absolutely love this method because observing authentic, everyday behavior helps researchers achieve Verstehen. That's basically a deep, empathetic understanding of the meanings people attach to their social actions.
Which brings us to Chapter 3, the Pygmalion study.
So, back in 1968, sociologists Rosenthal and Jacobson decided to test this labeling theory and the self-fulfilling prophecy in a real primary school. And their methodology was, honestly, incredibly audacious. Here's how they did it. Step 1, the setup. The researchers administered what they told everyone was a highly advanced IQ test. But here's the catch. It was completely fake. Step 2, the label. Based on this fake test, they identified a specific group of students to the teachers as academic bloomers, kids who are allegedly guaranteed to show rapid intellectual growth. And then Step 3, they just left. They waited a whole year for teachers to interact with these students, and then they returned to measure the actual academic progress of the kids.
Now, what's really interesting about this study is the makeup of that group of bloomers. The researchers selected exactly 20% of the student body to get this super positive label, but they didn't pick them based on test scores. No way. They chose that 20% entirely at random. So the teachers fully believed they had the absolute brightest kids in their class, but in reality, these students were essentially just drawn out of a hat.
All right, Chapter 4, the self-fulfilling prophecy.
So, when Rosenthal and Jacobson finally returned a year later, they found a jaw-dropping result. That random 20% who were labeled as bloomers had actually made significantly more academic progress than the rest of the students. It's wild. And this brilliantly illustrates the self-fulfilling prophecy. These kids didn't start out fundamentally smarter than their peers. They improved simply because their teachers expected them to. The teacher's belief in that bloomer label subtly changed how they interacted. They probably offered a bit more encouragement, maybe a little more patience, or slightly more challenging work. And all of that caused the students to internalize that positive label and just thrive.
Okay, Chapter 5, the PET evaluation.
We've heard this fascinating story, but as sociologists, we really need to conduct a critical autopsy of this research method. We do this using the Practical, Ethical, and Theoretical Framework, or PET for short. First up are the practical hurdles. Look, conducting a field experiment in a school isn't exactly a walk in the park. You have to navigate what we call gatekeepers. That means getting explicit permission from head teachers just to get in the door. Second, there's the whole issue of time. Unlike a quick questionnaire, field experiments are incredibly time-consuming. Rosenthal and Jacobson had to wait a full calendar year just to see their results. And finally, researchers just need the sheer funding and opportunity to pull off longitudinal studies like this in the first place.
So the crucial point is really centered on the ethical factors. Field experiments can be an absolute ethical minefield. Just think about Rosenthal and Jacobson's setup for a second. The participants completely lacked informed consent. The entire premise relied on blatant deception. The IQ test was a total fake, and the teachers were flat out lied to. But even more concerning is the potential for real harm. By randomly assigning this positive, attention-grabbing label to only 20% of the students, there was a massive risk of educational and psychological neglect for the remaining 80% who were just kind of left behind without that special bloomer status.
Finally, we need to look at the theoretical factors. On the plus side, field experiments have incredibly high validity. Why? Because they're conducted in normal, natural settings. You're seeing authentic, everyday behavior, not some artificial reaction in a sterile lab. However, a major theoretical limitation is the Hawthorne effect. This is the risk that participants, like the teachers in this case, might actually change their behavior consciously or unconsciously simply because they know they're being watched. And there's also a much larger theoretical debate here regarding determinism. Does labeling theory assume a little too much? It really raises the question of whether students always just passively accept these labels or if they actually have the agency to reject negative expectations and succeed anyway.
To kind of bring that all together, let's look at a structured summary of field observations. On the strength side, we get this incredibly in-depth, detailed data that offers high validity in real-life settings, which really helps researchers achieve that empathetic Verstehen. But on the limitation side, researchers are constantly battling the Hawthorne effect, the immense time and access constraints caused by gatekeepers, and the harsh reality that this kind of highly qualitative data is actually really hard to quantify into neat, tidy statistics.
And that brings us to our final chapter, Chapter 6, Ethics versus Knowledge.
This is where we really have to synthesize things. We have to weigh the incredible value of what was learned against the very real cost of how it was discovered. Rosenthal and Jacobson fundamentally changed our understanding of the education system, proving for sure that teacher expectations have real, measurable impacts on a student's entire life. But, it leaves us with this lingering, provocative thought. Does the monumental discovery of the self-fulfilling prophecy truly justify the blatant deception of those teachers and the potential educational harm to the students who are left behind? Where exactly do we draw the line between advancing sociological knowledge and protecting the individuals we study? It's a tough one. I'll leave you to ponder that ultimate limit of research. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the labels around you.